Well, hello there everyone, and welcome to the first part of today's video lecture on Kant. This is going to come in three parts, all of which we'll be talking in one way or another about Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. In this first part, what I want to do is just give a kind of introduction to Kant and go over some preliminaries that will be useful as we move forward. So let's go ahead and get started then. So Kant, his dates were 1724 to 1804. So he lived to the age of 80. He was born in Königsberg, East Prussia, which is now part of Germany. By normal standards, he led a pretty boring life. He never actually traveled at all. He never even left the city that he was born in, and he never married. But in terms of his philosophical work, it was just extraordinarily influential. I'm inclined to say he's probably the third most influential moral philosopher ever, behind Plato and Aristotle. And really, he was a sort of quintessential Enlightenment philosopher. He was writing during the Enlightenment in Europe and sort of embodied the movement's emphasis on human reason and rationality. So, like the other philosophers that we've read so far, he worked in a whole bunch of philosophical areas. Of course, we're just looking at his moral philosophy, but that's not all that he did. Sometimes he's referred to as a system-building philosopher, so the paradigmatic system builder. And the reason is that although he's working in all these different philosophical areas, they're all kind of united by a common theme, which we'll talk more about later. And so he's got one sort of grand unified system, and that's led a lot of contemporary philosophers who might call themselves Kantians or who follow Kant's work closely in their own it's led them to often accept every aspect of Kant's philosophy, what he does in metaphysics and epistemology, as well as what he does in ethics, and for that matter aesthetics, because it all just fits together so nicely, and it's all supposed to be accepted wholesale as one grand system. Of course, we don't need to do that. We won't even be talking about what his work consists of in other philosophical areas, but if you happen to be familiar with any of his other philosophical work, the point is it's not important that you accept all of those other tenets of his philosophy in order to accept his moral philosophy. Many people find his ethics very compelling while not accepting anything else that he did in his writings. So some of the main themes that in his ethical writings have just had a huge influence on the path that moral philosophy has taken since the time that he wrote. And these ideas have also had a huge influence on popular moral culture and our everyday moral lives, whether we recognize it or not. And, I guess what I'm trying to say is that a lot of these ideas may already be familiar to you, having just seeped into the popular culture and the sort of standard current of philosophical thought. So I'll give you a couple of examples of things that you may have heard of, which have their origin really in Kant. One of the main themes of his work is that every human being is an end in himself or an end in herself, and should be treated as such. That means that no human being should be used as a mere means to somebody else's end. We'll talk at great length as this unit proceeds about what that means, if that jargon is unfamiliar to you, or if upon reflecting on it now you just don't have any idea what it means. Don't worry, because we'll obviously be talking a great deal about that. Another example, though, of one of his ideas or main themes in his work that has had an influence even in popular, moral philosophy, as it's, been captured by the popular imagination, is the idea that there's a really tight-knit connection between morality and freedom. That somehow human freedom and ethics really go hand in hand. Much more on that later as well. So, a couple of things to keep an eye out for as we move forward. In particular, I want you to try to keep one eye on the material that we've already covered, because there's some really interesting connections between, in particular, Aristotle and Kant. So, first, you'll recall that Aristotle's view was that the virtuous person takes pleasure in doing what is right or virtuous or good. That's something that Kant resists vehemently. He does not think that the morally good person takes pleasure in doing the morally good thing. And then second, recall that Aristotle's view involved reference to the idea that a human being's function must have something to do with our capacity for reason and rationality. Now that's something that Kant accepts, but he takes it in a different direction. So it'll be interesting to compare and contrast these ideas, or the positions that these two philosophers take on these ideas as we move forward. So you might be wondering, what's with this weird, convoluted name of this book, The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals? So I want to say just a little bit about that. The groundwork, this book, isn't Kant's entire Metaphysics of Morals. It's only an attempt to establish the preliminary and most fundamental part of his Metaphysics of Morals, or his ethics. You might think of it as him in this book laying the groundwork, or laying the foundation, for a more detailed investigation. And as a matter of fact, he continues with that investigation later in a book called The Metaphysics of Morals, which picks up sort of where this one left off. And if you're wondering just what the Metaphysics of Morals means, that'll become clear as we move on. So I want to give you a little bit of background because we're making a huge leap forward just in terms of the sheer amount of time that's elapsed between Aristotle and Kant. And we're not going to be talking about any of the philosophical work that was done in between them, but there was, of course, interesting philosophical work being done. It's just that very little medieval philosophy contained ethical insight that's on a par with either Aristotle or Kant. Now that's why we're skipping over 2,000 years of philosophy and picking up with Kant. So since Kant was writing in a context which is really far removed from the ancient Greek philosophy we've been talking about, it'd be a mistake to think that Kant is directly engaging with somebody like Aristotle. There are ways in which he is, and I sort of alluded to those in a couple of slides back. But he's engaging in a more direct fashion with his contemporaries, the people who've written directly before him and the people who are writing at the time that he's writing. And so I think it'll help just to situate his work within the context of his contemporaries. I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing this, but there's one important thing that we need to talk about, and it'll help us to answer this question. What kind of philosophical work was going on immediately prior to, and more importantly, what was Kant responding to? And that one thing that I want to talk about is the debate, which was really raging at that time, and it was a debate between what have come to be known as empiricists and rationalists. So empiricist philosophers claimed that all of our knowledge, all of it, every last bit of it, and that includes, therefore, all of our moral knowledge, all of it is derived from experience of the world. So you might be familiar with John Locke, who was a great empiricist and claimed that we come into the world with a blank slate of sorts. We don't have any innate or inborn knowledge. That's something that Plato thought that we had. Plato thought that we had innate or inborn knowledge, knowledge of, well, all kinds of things, really, but in particular, knowledge of the good. We could even have moral knowledge when we're born. Of course, we don't have access to it when we're born. We have to recollect it, according to Plato. And so in this sense, Plato was really a rationalist. The empiricists pushed back on this Platonic idea that we could have innate or inborn knowledge. That's really what motivated the move by empiricists like Locke to develop the position known as empiricism, which holds that all of our knowledge comes from experience of the world. We come into the world with a blank slate, contra Plato, and we don't know anything. We don't form any knowledge until we experience things. So that stands in stark contrast to the rationalists, and the most extreme of them claim the exact opposite, that all truths about the world could be derived from self-evident rational principles, that anything that could be known by reflection. So if it's possible to know something, it must be possible to know that thing by reflection without investigating or experiencing the empirical world at all. So you can see that this is the exact opposite position that the empiricists take. It's not a position that very many rationalists took. This, as I say, is the most extreme form of rationalism. But this would be the exact opposite position. And then more rationalists, the less extreme ones, and so really all rationalists believe that at least some things that can be known, some truths, for example, the existence of God, the immortality of the soul, and the requirements of morality, at least these things could be known without experience. They could be known just by reflection, because they're self-evident, or they could be proven by a deductive argument of the form that we talked about at the beginning of the course in our primer on logic and reasoning. So these are the two positions, empiricism and rationalism, and what they disagree about is the source of our knowledge, how it is that we can know things. Right, so one thing I should have mentioned is that this less extreme form of rationalism, which just holds that some things, not necessarily all, but at least some things can be known without experience, this less extreme form likewise contradicts empiricism. So, if you're an empiricist, you have to deny even this more modest form of rationalism, which just holds that some truths can be known without experiencing the world. Okay, I don't know what's going on with this slide here. Let's just get the whole thing up. So, now I really think that understanding this debate is crucial to understanding Kant, because he found himself in the position of trying to reconcile these two positions. There's a sense in which he felt like there's truth in both empiricism and rationalism. Of course, they can't both be true simultaneously. They're positions that contradict one another. But some of the elements, or some of the motivations for embracing either or both of these views get incorporated into Kant's philosophy. And it's in that sense that he's really trying to reconcile the two positions. In a minute, we're going to talk about two different distinctions. We're going to do that on the next slide. And his emphasis, or his extensive use of these two distinctions, was really employed in an effort to get clear on the structure of that empiricist-rationalist debate. I think if you reflect on it once I introduce and discuss those two distinctions, you'll see how they play into the empiricism and rationalism debate. Okay, another reason for talking about the two distinctions we're going to discuss on the next slide is that Kant's approach to answering philosophical questions really did involve a massive amount of technical machinery. And so I want to introduce just a very small portion of that technical vocabulary before moving on to the real content of the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals. And the technical vocabulary I have in mind is, as I've already indicated, it focuses on these two distinctions. They are the a priori and a posteriori distinction and the analytic and synthetic distinction. So let's start with the analytic-synthetic distinction. So this is a distinction that concerns what makes a judgment or proposition true or false. Okay, that's what this distinction is about. And here we go. So an analytic judgment is a judgment or proposition that is true by definition. So let me give you an example of that. If I tell you that all bachelors are unmarried men, it seems that this is true, and it seems that it's true just as a matter of definition. The truth of it is guaranteed by the definition of the terms in it. So that statement, that all bachelors are unmarried men, is true precisely because of the meaning of the concepts unmarried man and bachelor, and nothing else. There's nothing else apart from the mere definitions of those terms that is needed to make that proposition true. By contrast, the synthetic judgment is just going to be a judgment that's not analytic. So no, that's not the most helpful definition, but the reason for that is that almost all propositions or statements that people make or are concerned to defend are synthetic. Right? They're just not true by definition. So an analytic judgment is really the exception, and so that's the one that requires the definition. And then we just define synthetic judgments negatively because those are the ones that don't have that special feature of being true by definition. So here's an example. I mean, just at random, University of Arizona campus has more than 5 buildings on it. That's true, but it's not true as a matter of definition. If I inspect these terms contained in the proposition, the University of Arizona campus, and the predicate of having more than 5 buildings on it, there's nothing about the definition of those terms that guarantees the truth of this proposition in the way that there is with this proposition, that all bachelors are unmarried men. You can see that this is true, or what makes this true is just the meanings of these terms. And that doesn't apply here. Okay. Now, moving on to the a priori, a posteriori distinction. This one, as opposed to concerning what makes a proposition or judgment true, this distinction, by contrast, concerns the way we know that a judgment or proposition is true. So that's a difference, right? We can ask the question, what makes a proposition true? And maybe the analytic synthetic distinction will help us answer that. But we can also ask, how do we know if a proposition is true? And that's a different question. And the a priori, a posteriori distinction can plausibly be used to help us answer that. So we'll say that a judgment is known a posteriori if it's known from experience or out of experience. So if a judgment's a posteriori, that means that it can be known by experiencing the world. So it is hot today. How do I know that if it's true? Well, I know it by experiencing the world. I couldn't know that just by reflection, just by sitting indoors, for instance. I have to go out and investigate the world, experience it in order to know it. So it's a judgment or proposition that is a posteriori. On the other hand, a judgment is known a priori if it is known independent of any particular experience. If it can be known without having to investigate the world or to have some experience in order to know it. So here's an example. Above we used it as hot today, so let's just take today is today. Right? I don't need to experience anything in the world. I don't need to do any kind of empirical investigation to know that that's true. I can know that just by reflection, just by using reason, and I can know it just by staying inside my head. Alright, so this leads us to 3 different possibilities in terms of how we can combine these distinctions to form compound judgments or propositions. So here are the 3 different possibilities. First, we can combine analytic and a priori. Remember, it was analytic synthetic and a posteriori a priori, but we can combine one from each of those and say that an analytic a priori judgment, that's a possibility, right? Because if a judgment is analytically true, we're going to know that a priori. Why? Because we don't need to experience anything in order to tell us what's contained in our concepts. We can do it just by reflection. So it's possible to have a proposition or judgment that is both analytic and a priori. However, for that reason given, it would not be possible to have an analytic a posteriori judgment. Make sure that you can see why that is. And then second, we can have synthetic a posteriori judgments. Why? Well, because if a judgment is known a posteriori from experience, it must be synthetic. So for example, we learned that the sky is blue rather than yellow from experience. That's going to be an example of a synthetic a posteriori proposition. And then the third possibility, it seems, is to have synthetic a priori judgments. So this kind of proposition or judgment, if there are any, would have this characteristic. It would be a proposition that can be known independently of any experience. Right? That's because it's a priori. So we get that part. So merely by reflecting and using reason, we can know it. But if it's synthetic, then it's also going to tell us something new about the world, something which isn't true just as a matter of definition. Okay, so this third possibility, a synthetic a priori judgment, would be an interesting kind of case if we found something that had these characteristics, these features. So there's actually a fair amount of dispute about whether synthetic a priori judgments are possible. And so this is a controversy in philosophy. It's not even clear whether such kinds of judgments could exist. It wouldn't be a contradiction, at least not at first blush. It doesn't seem like it'd be a contradiction, but it would certainly be surprising or interesting if it turned out that certain judgments were both synthetic and a priori. That's the kind of judgment that Kant is interested in. He thinks that there can be such judgments, synthetic a priori, and in particular he thinks that if pure reason can be used to tell us anything substantial or important about the world, or about what we morally ought to do, then it's going to do so through synthetic a priori judgments. Okay, so he's going to hold, ultimately, as we'll see, that moral judgments or moral commands are synthetic a priori. So the really important thing, though, with having introduced these two sets of distinctions and tried to map them onto one another, I'd say the most important thing is just that you're able to remember what these four different technical terms mean. Synthetic, analytic, a priori, a posteriori. Why? Because when you're reading Kant, you're going to see that he uses these terms quite often. And if you get thrown off each time he uses one of them because you can't remember what they mean, it's going to make it more difficult to comprehend what's going on. So I'd encourage you to go back and review what those terms mean so that you can rattle them off in the form of a definition and therefore be in a good position to follow Kant as we move forward. All right, well, just a little bit about our approach. We're going to be doing a rather close reading of this text. We're going to take things quite slowly, more so than we have with Plato and Aristotle. Why? Well, that's just because this reading is really quite difficult. We're going to be reading less each day of Kant than we read each day of Plato and Aristotle. But it'd be a mistake to think that because we're reading less, you don't have to spend as much time on it. This is very difficult reading, as I've said. And you're going to need to spend more time reading a page of Kant than you did reading a page of Plato or Aristotle. That is, if you're interested in getting anything out of this and doing well on quizzes and on your paper that covers Kant. So that just about wraps it up for this first part of the video lecture. I've got two more I'm going to post today. The most important thing, as usual, is that you've read before watching these videos. If you haven't, that's okay because I've just been setting things up. But certainly before watching the second video, make sure that you've read. The second and third will be posted at some point today, Probably the third one won't be posted until this evening, but that's okay because really you don't need to, or I would rather that you not actually watch the video lectures before doing your discussion posts, which is one of the reasons that I haven't felt much of a need to get them posted early in the morning or even early in the afternoon, because I want you to be doing your discussion posts primarily using the reading as a resource. I want you to watch the video lectures or review the PowerPoints every day, of course, but I want to try to get discussion going on the basis of your thoughts from the reading as opposed to what I've said in the video lectures. And so do post your, feel free, or I encourage you even, to post your discussion posts today before even watching all three of these videos. But in any case, good luck with it, and at some point today do watch all three. I look forward to reading your discussion posts and reading your papers, which you'll be submitting at some point tonight. So I'll see you soon.